Chapter 1. The Bell Tolls at Dawn. The old iron bell rang through the chill morning air, echoing across the muddy courtyard of Lord Evergallen's estate. Piercing the stillness, Edric stirred in the straw-stuffed mattress, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and mildew. The bitter cold crept through the cracks in the servants' quarters, where 6 others still dozed in a haze of breath and warmth. He blinked his eyes open, catching a glimpse of pale light filtering through the warped wooden shutters on the far wall. With stiff joints and aching muscles, he pushed himself upright, his fingers numb as he reached for his patched woolen tunic. There was no time for luxury, no delay permitted if he missed the second bell. The steward would have him scrub latrines until dusk. He slipped into rough trousers, tugged on his leather boots, still damp from yesterday's slop run, and reached for his belt of keys. A rooster's cry joined the bell's last toll, signaling that it was time for the first of many duties awaiting him before nightfall. Outside, the dirt path was wet from the evening storm, and his steps left deep impressions that would vanish by midday. The sky hung low with gray clouds, and the smell of smoke and pig manure drifted on the cold wind from the lower pens. He passed the kitchens first, where cook Bertha shouted commands through clouds of steam, waving a ladle like a battle flag. The scent of boiling oats and burnt onions filled the air, mixing with the tang of wet stone and stale ale from the night before. Edric avoided eye contact one glance, and she'd have him scrubbing pots for an hour, while the fire spat cinders at his arms. Instead, he ducked into the stables, where warm breath from the horses misted in the still air and straw clung to his boots. He greeted the animals with a gentle pat, grabbing the bristled broom and manure fork, leaning against the back wall near the troughs. Before anything else, he had to clean the Lord's mare's stall, for she was prized and treated nearly better than the steward himself. He worked quickly, flinging old hay and waste into a wooden barrow, sweat rising beneath his tunic despite the morning frost. Each stroke of the broom echoed in the quiet barn, only broken by the gentle whinny of horses and the soft crunch of hooves on straw. Once the mare's stall was fresh, he laid a new bed of hay and fetched the carved feed bucket filled with soaked oats and ground barley. By the time the third bell rang from the chapel tower, Edric had already cleaned 2 stalls and carried water from the well twice. His shoulders burned from the labor, but the ache was familiar, like the weight of a coat he could never take off. Back in the courtyard, the other servants stirred like insects in the light, yawning and shivering, clutching cloaks to their thin bodies. The steward barked orders from the top of the steps, his ledger in one hand, a long birch rod tucked beneath his belt. "Edric, you're to sweep the west corridor and polish the lantern sconces, no soot, mind you, or the master will have your hide." He nodded silently, jogging toward the manor's side entrance, dodging a wagon rumbling by with crates of salted meat and dried turnips. Inside the stone halls, the air was heavy with damp and smoke, and his breath fogged as he hurried toward the supply closet. He retrieved a rag, a tin of animal fat polish, and the splintered broom with the loose bristles that always snagged on flagstones. As he swept, each stone revealed layers of filth and dust, proof that the night guard never did his rounds as ordered. He worked in rhythm, footsteps soft against the walls, the broom swishing like a whisper, the rags soaked and darkened with grime. Every sconce he polished reflected his warped face back at him, a blurry servant's mask smeared with soot and duty. By noon, he was finished with the west corridor, but the steward returned with more orders, and a deep frown carved into his jowls. The hall outside the Lord's study needs scrubbing, and take care not to scuff the wood. The carpenter's boy nearly lost a finger for that. Edric wiped his brow, took the mop from a peg on the wall, and filled a pail from the cold stone basin at the hall's end. He knelt and scrubbed until his knuckles stung and his shoulders trembled, the floor gleaming like wet bark beneath flickering torchlight. The scent of lavender oil wafted from beneath the study door, where Lady Evergarland took her midday rest among silks and perfumed scrolls. He dared not pause, his knees numb and trousers soaked. Each minute was weighed, and a missed task meant lashes or worse. Finally, the steward signaled a break with a grunt and a twitch of the ledger, and Edric limped to the servant's kitchen for bread. It was coarse and dry, baked 3 days past, but he chewed in silence, drinking from a cup of weak beer meant to soften the crumbs. The warmth of the hearth pulled at his eyes, but sleep was a distant dream. There was still the chamber pots to collect and clean. He stood, wiped crumbs from his chin, and grabbed the wooden yoke, the iron hooks dangling like shackles from each end. Each room was a challenge, some filled with the stench of illness, others with the sour odor of old wine and heavy drapery. He carried them carefully, walking with the yoke across his shoulders, knees bent, balance precise. One spill, and he'd be scrubbing for days. Behind the manor, past the herb garden and bee cages, he dumped the contents into the trench and covered them with ash and leaves. The smell clung to him, no matter how far he walked or how long he stood in the cold wind scraping his face. Returning the yoke to its place, he fetched a bucket of water, adding a sprig of rosemary before scrubbing his arms and face raw. The sun hung low in the sky, tinged with gold and fading fast, casting long shadows across the chapel stones and tower walls. He knew his final duties would begin now, the tidying of the great hall before evening feast, the wiping of boots by the entry stair. And still, after all that, he would clean himself if water remained in the barrel and the others hadn't taken the last dry cloth. Nightfall would come like a weight, but not before Edric prepared every room, every rug, every flickering torch and floorboard. Because when the moon rose over Evergarland, Chapter 2, a task for every hour, the sunlight barely warmed the frost-kissed stones, and Edric's back already ached from lifting sacks of barley in the courtyard. A loud whistle from the steward echoed off the manor walls, calling all hands to the front gate for new arrivals. A merchant caravan was pulling in, wheels clacking, oxen snorting, and cloaked riders chattering in thick accents from the northern pass. Edric rushed to help unload barrels, lifting with 2 others, his breath visible in the air as they strained beneath the weight. The steward checked each item against a ledger, marking names and orders, while his assistant tapped crates to check for spoilage. A carved wooden chest, heavier than it looked, was taken to the Lord's solar, and Edric wasn't allowed to look inside. After unloading, he was sent to refill the lanterns hanging in the entryway, which had smoked through the night and left black stains. He dipped a rag in vinegar and wiped each sconce clean before pouring new oil into the hollowed metal holders, careful not to spill. The midday meal passed unnoticed. Just a crust of bread and a raw onion he stole from a pantry bin while no one watched. At the well, he lowered the bucket hand over hand, watching the reflection ripple like a mirror to a world he didn't know. He filled 10 buckets in a row, pouring each one into barrels for the kitchen, then returning again without a word of thanks. The castle mason stopped him near the stairwell, asking for help lifting stone tiles for a repair near the chapel cloister. Edric agreed, without hesitation, even though his legs trembled from hauling water and his palms were raw from rope and ash. They moved the tiles into a wheelbarrow, wheeled it up a slope where moss made footing slippery, and laid them along a crumbling path. For this favor, the mason gave him a plum half bruised, but sweeter than anything Edric had tasted since summer ended. When the bell rang again, it meant laundry, and he joined the others down by the riverbank, where garments soaked in cold water. They beat the fabric against smooth stones, bubbles floating downstream as hands turned red and cracked beneath the icy surface. He scrubbed tunics and tablecloths until the skin on his knuckles split open, bleeding slightly with each twist of linen. Back at the manor, he hung the garments on ropes by the outer wall, wind snapping them like sails on a warship at sea. Then came the dogs, 4 hounds belonging to the Lord's youngest son, needed brushing and feeding before dusk patrol along the woods. Edric knelt beside them, combing through fur for burrs and fleas, his fingers moving carefully to avoid being nipped by sharp teeth. Their breath was hot and foul, their coats shedding into his lap. But he finished without complaint and carried their bowls to the kennels. By late afternoon, he was ordered to sweep the east garden path, where crushed herbs and loose soil stuck to the broom's bristles. He paused only once, wiping sweat from his forehead, as a noblewoman passed by without acknowledging his presence or his labor. When the bell rang for the evening's first prayer, Edric was on his knees polishing silverware for the high table's coming feast. Each fork and knife had to shine without streak or spot, or the steward would throw them back in the water for him to redo. He worked faster, knowing the more he completed now, the sooner he might finish before the stars emerged above the spire. Chapter 3. Secrets Beneath the Stairs. Edric had never been inside the private stairwell that led to the Lord's ancestral archive, but today the steward handed him a key. The records room needed dusting, and the Lord's brother, a scribe from the capital, would arrive at dawn expecting nothing out of place. He descended the narrow steps, torch in one hand, the iron key cold in the other, heart thudding at the thought of ancient secrets. The walls narrowed as he moved deeper, cobwebs thickening like mist, and the smell of damp parchment filled his lungs with rot. The key turned with a groan, and the wooden door creaked open to reveal shelves lined with scrolls, boxes, and ledgers bound in cracked leather. Dust blanketed everything, and when Edric wiped a shelf, his rag turned nearly black from centuries of soot and mold. He moved methodically, sweeping cobwebs, dusting bindings, sorting loose quills and weights, careful not to tear anything brittle with time. There was one scroll half opened on the floor, its wax seal broken, showing faded drawings of a castle older than Evergalon. He did not linger, whatever it was. It wasn't tea meant for him, and he carefully returned it to the shelf where he defound it. At the back of the room, behind an armor stand, he found a loose stone, and behind it a hollow space barely wide enough for a hand. Inside was a cloth pouch containing several silver coins, a broken ring, and a folded paper with symbols he couldn't read. He stared for a long moment, debating whether to tell the steward or keep it hidden. But finally, he replaced the stone and moved on. By the time he emerged into the upper hall, the torch was nearly spent, and dust clung to his skin like a second shirt. The steward met him at the landing, asking only, "All done?" And Edric nodded, handing back the key with trembling fingers. He wasn't sure what he had found beneath those stairs, but he knew it wasn't meant to be disturbed, not by a servant like him. Still, something about the moment lingered, a weight he carried into the next chore, sweeping the chapel's aisle before evening sermon. The priest's chanting echoed off the stones as Edric wiped the altar steps, eyes lowered, thoughts drifting back to the secret cache. Outside, the wind picked up and the clouds thickened, promising rain by midnight and cold floors for those without a place by the hearth. Chapter 4. The Rain and the Rush by Morning. The sky had opened in a steady downpour, soaking the courtyard until puddles formed like small ponds between the flagstones. Rain drummed against the tiled roofs and poured from gutters onto walkways, turning dirt paths into slick trails of mud and straw. Edric's cloak was thin and already soaked as he crossed the courtyard toward the supply shed, water dripping from his sleeves and hair. Today's list began with firewood, 3 loads to the kitchen, 1 to the armory, and a final stack to the lady's personal chamber hearth. He hauled the logs 2 at a time, arms straining as he balanced on slick stone steps, boots squelching with every cautious movement. The kitchen fire hissed as he threw the logs onto the smoldering pile, steam rising as Bertha nodded without lifting her eyes from the pot. Then to the armory, where a squire waited impatiently by the door, tapping 1 boot and asking why he was late before Edric spoke. He said nothing, only set the wood beside the iron racks and turned to collect the next bundle before the stew was ready. At Lady Evergolan's chamber, the door opened only wide enough for a maid's pale hand to accept the wood. No words exchanged. On his way down, Edric slipped on a stone stair and landed hard, elbow first, knocking the wind from his chest and vision askew. He lay still for a moment, the rain stinging his face, before rising to his feet, pain sharp but ignored, like always. No time for injury or rest. The broom awaited him at the west wall, where last night's storm had blown leaves into wet clumps. He swept in wide strokes, water splashing up his arms, dead leaves sticking to his fingers as the wind fought his every motion. From a balcony above, the steward watched like a hawk, ledger in hand, lips pursed, ready to shout if he missed a corner. Edric worked faster, heart pounding, broom moving in practiced rhythm as he tried to outpace the chill that soaked through his bones. A dog barked nearby, followed by shouts from the outer gate. A delivery cart had collapsed in the mud and blocked the entry path. The steward pointed to Edric and 3 others, and they rushed to the scene, lifting crates and pushing the cart back onto stable ground. Mud coated Edric's legs up to the knee, his boots now filled with water, but the path was cleared, and the steward marked it done. Inside, he changed into dry linen and returned to the pantry to restock shelves with root vegetables, flour sacks, and wheels of hardened cheese. Each item had its place, and every label had to face outward if the steward noticed even one turned wrong. Punishment followed swiftly. By noon, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and Edric was called to assist the blacksmith's apprentice in hauling coal from the lower storeroom. The stairwell was steep and narrow, and the sacks of coal heavy, their grit seeping through cloth to stain his hands black. They worked in silence, grunting with effort, sweat and coal dust mingling until their faces looked like shadows in the fading light. The blacksmith grunted his approval and handed Edric a small tin of lardware and precisa, token of thanks for heavy lifting well done. Back at the manor, the steward handed him a new list: polish every brass railing on the upper floor before the evening inspection. Edric sighed but nodded and set to work. His rag and polished tin, now familiar friends, as his hands moved with automatic skill. The railings curved like serpents along the walls, and each took time to clean, grime hiding in grooves and beneath carved edges. He worked as the sun dipped low, casting golden beams through narrow windows, his body aching but still moving, still obeying every order. By the time the bell rang for supper, Edric had polished every inch of brass, and the railings glowed like warm metal fire. He limped to the servants' hall, where broth and bread awaited, and silence reigned except for the occasional scrape of spoon against bowl. That night, as the rain returned and lightning flashed across the hills, Edric lay awake, muscles throbbing, wondering if tomorrow would ever be different. Chapter 5. The Feast and the Flames. A messenger had arrived just before dawn with news that a visiting lord would dine at Evergallen that night, and preparations began at once. Edric was pulled from laundry duty and sent to the great hall, where he joined others in scrubbing floors and dusting chandeliers with ash rags. The hall had to shine, every stone swept, every window cleaned, until the glass gleamed in the candlelight soon to follow. He climbed a ladder to polish the high sconces, each one coated in wax and dust from weeks of neglect and nightly smoke. Below him, maids bustled with linens and tapestries, unfolding rich cloths embroidered with lions, eagles, and the everglon crest of iron trees. The cook demanded wine barrels, and Edric was sent to the cellar, where the air was cool and the smell of old oak lingered. He rolled the barrels carefully along the floor, avoiding cracks that might snag the edge and send them tipping over onto their sides. In the kitchen, flames leaped high as Bertha barked orders, and Edric joined a line, peeling onions and carrots for the feast's stew. Tears ran down his cheeks from the onions, but he kept cutting, blade flashing as he filled basket after basket without pause. When the meat was brought out, thick slabs of venison and pheasant, he helped load them onto the spits that turned above open fire pits. By midday, the hall was nearly ready, and Edric was told to assist with table-setting silver, not pewter, for this was noble company. He laid forks and knives, polished plates, folded napkins, and placed goblets with care, all under the steward's watchful eye and sharp tongue. When the guests began to arrive, Edric was sent to the main entry to take cloaks, which dripped water and smelled of damp wool. He hung each one precisely, brushing off leaves or mud with his sleeve before returning to take the next, nodding silently at each nobleman. As the feast began, Edric retreated to the back of the hall to refill goblets, fetch forgotten items, and carry trays between courses. He moved in practiced silence, never speaking, never making eye contact unless spoken to first, always watching, always aware of who needed what. Toward the end of the meal, a drunken lord knocked over a candelabra, and Edric rushed forward with a wet cloth before the flames spread. He stamped it out quickly, earning a grunt of approval from the steward and a lazy cheer from a laughing knight deep in his cups. As dessert was served candied apples, honey cakes, and sugared almonds, Edric collected the first dirty plates, careful not to spill sauces on the linens. By the time the guests retired to the drawing rooms, Edric and 3 others began clearing the tables, stacking trays, and washing platters in the basin. The feast was over for the nobles, but for the servants it had just begun a long night of cleaning, scrubbing, and preparing for the next day. He worked until the candles burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, until his hands bled. Only then, just before the bell, tolled midnight, did Edric allow himself to wash his face and crawl into his cot, the fire long out. His dreams were shallow, interrupted by pain and thunder, but even as he slept, he knew morning would command, so would the broom. Chapter 6. Whispers in the servants' hall. The wind howled through the narrow cracks in the window, and Edric pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders before the morning bell rang. He was already awake when the tolling began, heart heavy from the weight of yesterday's labor and the certainty of today's chores. The servants' hall was quiet that morning, save for the sound of feet on stone and the occasional cough echoing off damp walls. He ate stale bread dipped in cold broth, while others whispered rumors about the visiting lord who insulted Lady Evergallen the night before. Someone claimed the steward had broken a goblet in anger after overhearing a jest about the late heiress hunting accident from 4 winters ago. Edric listened in silence, eyes down, hands clutching the chipped cup, pretending he wasn't hearing anything that might get him beaten for repeating. Rumors were dangerous currency to spend then survive, so he carried them quietly to the stables, where fresh hay needed to be spread before sunrise. The horses snorted and stamped as he worked, dust rising in golden shafts of light as he hauled bales and filled feed troughs. Each movement warmed his limbs, but the ache from the feast lingered in his back, like iron hooks dragging him slowly downward. At mid-morning, he was summoned to assist the scribe from the capital, who needed parchment, ink, and firewood carried to the upper study. The man barely acknowledged him, pointing instead at scrolls or snapping his fingers when he required more candles or another inkwell. Books lined the walls, real books, not ledgers, some locked behind glass, others stacked beside oil lamps, their pages worn soft with generations of fingers. As Edric placed a new log in the hearth, the scribe asked him suddenly, "Do you know how to read, boy?" Edric froze, then shook his head slowly, heart racing, unsure if honesty or ignorance would protect him more in this moment. The man nodded as if expecting the answer, then returned to writing, lips moving silently as his quill scratched across the parchment. Back downstairs, Edric was told to clean the infirmary floors, still sticky with herbs, spilled oils, and dried blood from an injury 2 nights prior. He knelt with a scrub brush and vinegar water, wiping between flagstones, nostrils burning from the scent of fever and boiled bark. A young maid passed by carrying a bundle of herbs, whispering something about the steward's cough worsening and a chamber pot stained dark. By early afternoon, the sky had gone gray again, clouds heavy with rain, and Edric was sent to fetch wood from the outer yard. The piles were soaked, and he had to strip away the wet layers to reach the dry logs beneath, his fingers going numb with cold. He loaded the bundle into a sack and hauled it on his back, steps slow, teeth clenched as the weight dragged at his spine. Inside, he passed the steward's quarters and paused for a moment, hearing muffled voices and the sound of glass breaking against stone. Whatever storm was brewing inside that room wasn't his business. He kept walking, kept quiet, kept moving toward the kitchen with his burden. Bertha caught him at the door and shoved a bucket into his hands, saying the scullery needed scrubbing before the Lord's midday ale arrived. He obeyed without a word, shoulders already sagging, knees sore, the air thick with the stink of fish bones and sour ale. While he scrubbed, the youngest page slipped on a pool of grease and split his lip open on the hearthstones. Edric helped him up, handed him a cloth, and silently wiped the blood off the floor before the steward could appear and demand explanations. He said nothing about the boy's tears, the bruise forming already, or the way servants learned to bleed quietly and quickly clean up after. Chapter 7. The frozen river. The frost returned with cruel vengeance, turning the stone courtyard into a brittle sheet of ice that cracked beneath Edric's boots. His breath came in clouds as he crossed the yard before dawn, following the steward's barked order to assist with river hauling. Twice a month, the castle's laundry and freshwater barrels were filled from the river below the slope, frozen, winding trail through brambles and frost. He joined two older servants, both grumbling, as they lifted buckets and sleds down the steep hill, hands wrapped in cloth for warmth. The river groaned beneath its icy shell, but a shallow opening near the reeds had been broken earlier with a pickaxe. They dipped the buckets slowly, avoiding slipping, balancing their loads, while their legs trembled from cold and strain with every trip up the hill. Edric's hands were red and cracked before the first barrel was filled, and blood from his knuckles mixed into the icy water. The second servant slipped halfway up the trail, and Edric dropped everything to help him, ignoring the shouted curses and threats from above. By the time they returned to the castle, their boots were soaked, their legs shaking, but the barrels were filled and no one had drowned. Inside, the steward looked at them briefly, then crossed their names off the ledger without even a word of thanks or nod of approval. Edric changed into dry socks by the fire in the scullery, then returned to fetch a broom for the entrance staircases. They were covered in slush, mud, and ash from dozens of boot servants, squires, and nobles alike dragging the cold inside with them. He scrubbed until the steps shone, the cold now inside his bones, deeper than the marrow, impossible to shake even near the hearth. The bell rang for chapel hour, and Edric was sent to clean the benches and wipe the wax from candle holders beneath the altar. He moved in silence, the priests back to him, chanting softly from a worn scroll, while snow fell gently through the open chapel doors. As the sermon ended, Edric took the collection box and followed the priest to the scribe's chamber, where each coin was counted in cold silence. The priest slipped Edric a single copper token and whispered, "For your hands," before returning to the altar, his robe dragging behind him. The coin would buy nothing more than a crust or crumb, but Edric held it like treasure, fingers curled tight around the faint warmth of copper. Chapter 8. The Noble's Secret. The frost still clung to the castle stones like stubborn moss, refusing to melt even as the midday sun climbed above the battlements with dull determination. Edric rose before the roosters again, his limbs stiff as wood, the straw of his bedding doing little to soften the aches that nested in his spine. He dressed quickly in his single spare tunic, which had been mended so many times that the thread held more than the cloth itself. Outside, the wind bit with teeth sharper than yesterday, and his breath streamed behind him like pale ghosts fleeing from his lungs. Today, he had been tasked with tending to Lord Elaine's visiting cousin, a nobleman from the southern coast, who arrived late the evening before. The man's presence had already stirred whispers. He wore black boots stitched with silver, his coat lined with sable, and his eyes sharp as broken glass. "Mind your posture when you serve him," the steward had warned, "and do not ask questions, no matter what he says or does." Edric had bowed in silence, the words pressing into him like iron branding, promising punishment should he forget them even briefly. He carried hot water and folded linens up to the noble's chamber, where a thick, perfumed fog of incense greeted him before the door creaked open. The noble stood at the window, his silhouette draped in velvet, speaking softly to himself, perhaps to someone unseen, while Edric stood still as stone. "You're early," the man said, without turning, his voice rich and slow, like honey stirred with something sour beneath it. Edric stepped forward, placed the basin on the table near the hearth, and arranged the linens neatly, eyes down, hands trembling from the heat of the copper. "Do you know what blood looks like beneath moonlight?" the noble asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade through silk. Edric didn't answer, uncertain whether the question was meant for him or for the shadow that clung to the noble's feet. "I do," the man continued, now turning toward him, his eyes catching the firelight in an unnatural glint, as if polished from within. Edric dared a glance, and immediately wished he hadn't. The noble's smile was too wide, and his hands were stained with something darker than wine. He finished his task quickly, nodding once and backing toward the door, heart thudding like a drum beaten for war inside his chest. "Leave the door open," the noble commanded, and Edric obeyed. Slipping out into the hallway and releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. By the time he reached the lower floor, the steward was waiting, arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he motioned Edric closer. "Did he speak to you?" he asked without preamble, his tone clipped and edged with worry poorly hidden beneath authority. "A little," Edric said, cautiously, "about moonlight." The steward muttered something under his breath and handed Edric a cloth. "Go clean the chapel candles. Do not speak of this again." It was not a suggestion, and Edric didn't need it repeated. He spent the next hour scrubbing wax from stone, watching it flake like shedding skin as his mind wandered back to that smile upstairs. In the chapel's silence, he could still hear the noble's voice, smooth and slithering, each word like a spider crawling behind his ears. He scrubbed harder, as if wax and memory were the same and could be peeled away with enough effort. As the bells tolled noon, a page arrived in a rush, asking for Edric to assist the laundress. Lady Evergallen's gowns had been soiled by accident. He followed, grateful to be among familiar smells against soap steam and boiling water were kinder scents than perfume and blood. The laundress, Greta, was swearing as she scrubbed red wine or something like it from embroidered silk, her arms slick with suds. Edric fetched more hot water, wrung out linens, and kept silent when Greta grumbled about the coastal bastard and his damned filthy habits. He heard more than he wanted, piecing together half hints about missing servants, strange stains, and doors locked from the inside with no key. As dusk began to fall, Edric was sent back up to deliver supper to the noble's room, a tray of roast pheasant, figs, and dark wine. His steps were slow this time, dread dragging at his ankles like lead shackles. When he knocked, the noble opened the door himself, now wearing a loose robe, his hair damp and curling against his forehead. "I was hoping it would be you," he said, smiling again, that same smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Edric placed the tray on the table and turned to leave, but the noble called him back. "Do you know why your steward fears me?" he asked, swirling his wine, the deep red liquid catching firelight in a mesmerizing dance. Edric said nothing, standing still, willing the moment to pass, to dissolve like steam on cold stone. "Because I remind him of something he buried years ago. Something with a pulse." Edric didn't reply. He bowed and left, this time closing the door tight behind him. Down the corridor, He passed another servant, a girl who hadn't spoken in weeks, her eyes wide, mouth sealed by memory or something worse. She looked at him and shook her head ever so slightly, then kept walking toward the lower levels, basket in hand, footsteps fading into silence. That night, as he curled into his straw bedding, Edric wondered how many servants had vanished in past winters without anyone bothering to ask why, and he began to understand that not all stains could be scrubbed away, not with soap, or boiling water, or prayers whispered in cold chapels. Chapter 9. The Midnight Spill. The castle had long since surrendered to nightfall. Its towering halls hushed beneath the weight of cold stars and distant owls that stirred in the woods beyond. Only the faint flicker of torchlight lined the narrow corridors, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and breathe like living things. Edric was not meant to be awake at this hour, but the sharp clatter of something breaking in the kitchen had pulled him from restless sleep. The air felt colder than usual as he slid from his straw pallet, wrapping himself in a rough wool cloak before tiptoeing down the stairs barefoot. At first, he thought it might have been a rat or a dropped ladle left too close to the table's edge. But as he reached the scullery door, he saw the outline of shattered pottery glinting on the floor, and something thick trailing in lines across the stone. A flagon of wine had been smashed it. The spill was wrong, the stain too dark, and the smell too sharp and metallic to be just wine. Edric crouched, hesitated, then touched the edge of the puddle, expecting sticky sweetness, but it smeared darker across his fingers, already drying like rust. He stood quickly, heart hammering, and backed into the passage, his feet slipping slightly on the cold surface as he turned toward the nearby pantry. The door to the pantry was open, hanging crooked on its hinges, and one of the servant boys' Tomas was lying face down just beyond it. A scream clawed up Edric's throat but never escaped. Instead, he stepped forward, numb and silent, crouched beside the boy, and turned him over. Tomas's eyes were wide, locked in fear, his mouth open in a frozen gasp, but there was no wound, no obvious violence, just stillness. It was as if his breath had been stolen, as if he had simply stopped living mid-motion, like a candle snuffed with a whisper. Edric ran, not to the steward, not to the guards, but to the chapel. He burst through the chapel doors and dropped to his knees, ignoring the priest's startled protest, his voice shaking as he recounted what he'd seen. Father Aldrich listened without interruption, his eyes narrowing, his lips pressed thin as parchment as Edric described the wine that wasn't wine. "This castle is old," the priest murmured, once the boy had finished. "Older than Lord Ailing. Older than any of us truly know. There are doors here, sealed for good reason. Secrets hidden behind stone and silence." Edric felt a chill crawl up his neck. "Was it the noble?" he whispered. The priest stood slowly, walking toward the altar, where a hidden drawer contained a bundle of faded scrolls, worn leather-bound texts, and a single silver dagger. "Keep this," he said, placing the small blade in Edric's hand. "You may never use it, but if you need it, you'll know." By the time Edric returned to the servants' quarters, the kitchen had been cleaned. The stain was gone, Tomas's body was gone, and no one spoke of it the next morning. Not the steward, who seemed unusually pale. Not the other servants, who kept their eyes down. Not even Greta, who was rarely silent about anything. Edric went through the motions of the day, scrubbing, carrying, pouring, and bowing, all while that silver dagger burned against his hip through layers of cloth. He couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of wood, Every groan of stone made him sit up, expecting someone or something to appear at the threshold. Just past midnight, he heard the whispering, not words, not language, just soft, rhythmic murmuring coming from behind the tapestry in the hallway. He crept toward it, each step slower than the last, until he stood before the woven cloth depicting St. Bronwyn's sacrifice. The whispering stopped. He lifted the edge, darkness. Then a stairwell, a hidden one, winding downward into the bowels of the castle. He should have turned back. He should have run. But he descended, one hand on stone, the other gripping the dagger until his knuckles ached. At the bottom was a door of blackened wood, swollen with age and moisture, sealed with a rusted iron bolt. He heard nothing now, no wind, no whispering, just the sound of his own heartbeat. He slid the bolt free. The door creaked open, and the cold that met him was not from this world. Chapter 10. The dust beneath the tapestries. The cold swallowed Edric whole the moment the door opened, wrapping around his bones like winter cloth soaked in death. He stepped inside, holding the dagger low and forward, its edge catching what little moonlight filtered down from above. The room beyond was vast, impossibly vast for a chamber beneath the castle, its walls arched and ancient, carved with glyphs no servant had ever been taught to read. Dust rose in thick clouds with each step, disturbing years, perhaps centuries, of undisturbed silence. Along the far wall, iron rings were bolted into stone, each connected to chains too heavy for any one man to carry. And between them were bones, dozens, hundreds, piled in mounds, some no larger than a child's arm, others curled in postures of agony, jaws open in final, unanswered screams. Edric nearly turned back, but then he heard it again. The whispering, now clearly from a single direction. A pillar of stone in the center of the room, tall and cracked, pulsing faintly with a light that came from within. He approached, heart thudding, the dagger shaking slightly in his grip. Carved into the stone was a name, not in Latin, not in the tongue of the church, but he could read it. It was his name, etched as if by blade, as if someone had known he would come. A gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him, and from the pillar emerged the figure of the noble, not in flesh, but in shadow, tall and grinning, his hands still dripping with invisible blood. "You are awake now," it said, voice echoing not from its mouth, but from the walls, the ceiling, the very stones beneath Edric's feet. "You carry the blade. You remember the boy. You saw the bones." "What are you?" Edric asked, his voice hoarse, the words tasting like ash. "I am the hunger that keeps this castle alive. I am the debt no one dares repay. You were born here for this." The dagger grew warm in Edric's hand, and somehow he understood. This place had chosen him, not as a servant, as its cleanser, as its final answer to centuries of silence. The pillar cracked, light bursting through like dawn through storm clouds, and the whispering turned to wailing. Edric raised the blade and drove it into the stone. The scream that followed shook the walls, and when the dust finally settled, the room was empty. Edric lay on the floor, breathless, alive, but no longer just a boy who cleaned floors. He had become something else entirely. Chapter 11. The steward's ledger. Morning light trickled into the high stone windows of the hall, brushing past the faded banners and warming the stone floor beneath Edric's sore feet. But the warmth did nothing to thaw the heavy silence that gripped the castle like a storm held in pause. No one spoke of the night before, yet every servant moved differently, quieter, slower. glancing behind themselves as if fearing what might be following. The bread was undercooked, the herbs improperly sorted, and the steward barked more than usual, but even he seemed less sharp than normal. He didn't shout when a pail of milk was spilled. He didn't strike the butcher's boy when he dropped the cleaver. Instead, he retreated into his quarters beside the tax room and shut the door behind him, bolting it with a loud clang even in daylight. Edric, still aching from the night beneath the castle, was ordered to scrub the scullery tiles clean, though no one told him what he was scrubbing away. The stones were already spotless. No blood, no wine, no signs of Tomas or the shattered flagon. But the memory remained. By mid-morning, Greta approached him in a rush, her eyes wild and her whisper sharp, tugging his tunic and nodding toward the steward's quarters. "He's locked himself in all morning, talking to himself," she murmured. "Something's wrong, Edric, worse than usual." Edric dried his hands, tucked the silver dagger beneath his belt, and followed the hallway around the back, where the steward's door stood shut tight. Behind it, low murmuring echoed a chant, perhaps, or a litany. Not prayerful, but rhythmic, dark, and urgent, like a drum made of bone. He knocked, no answer. He knocked again, harder, voice steady. "Master Eldon." "It's Edric. Are you well?" Silence fell abruptly. Then the bolt creaked. The door opened just enough to show one eye bloodshot, rimmed in red and a shadow behind him, too dark for the small chamber to cast. "You've seen it?" the steward whispered, more accusation than question. "You've touched the blood. You've heard the name." Edric swallowed, meeting his gaze. "What is it? What's under the castle?" The steward pulled the door wider and stepped back. "Come in, quickly, and lock it behind you." Inside, the room was crammed with ledger stacked high on tables, chairs. Even under the cot pages covered in ink that turned rust-colored at the edges. Maps of the castle were pinned to the walls, drawn not just with walls and towers, but with hidden staircases, blocked chambers, and markings in a language unfamiliar. Eldon moved to a low chest and opened it, revealing an older book bound in dried leather, its cover scorched and sealed with melted wax. "This," he said, "was left by the last steward and the one before him, each adding what they dared record." He opened the book. The first page bore only one word, debt. The second, oath. The third was a list long and cramped of names, servants, stable boys, cooks, pages, and nobles. Each name ended with a date and a single symbol beside it. Some were marked with a knife, others with a circle. A few, like Tomas, had no symbol at all, just an empty space after the date. "What does it mean?" Edric asked, voice low. Eldon looked older in that moment, his shoulders hunched, the tremble in his hands visible as he turned another page. "It means this castle feeds on more than coin or harvest. It requires offerings. Every generation, a few must be taken, disappear, die, serve beneath, and if it's not satisfied, the hunger spreads." Edric felt the truth of it deep in his marrow, the echo of the whispers still ringing faintly from the night before. He remembered the bones, the pillar, the voice that spoke his name. "There's a ledger for every decade," Eldon continued, lifting a second book. "And look, your name appears before the last page. It was there, Edric, son of Willen, a blank space after no date, no mark. You were chosen, but something changed," Eldon said. "You survived the place others don't. It means it wants you for something else. For what?" But the steward only shook his head. "I don't know. But we must find out before the Feast of Lanterns." Edric stepped back from the desk. "That's in 5 days. Yes, Eldon said grimly. And if history holds, 5 will vanish that night. Vanish, or worse. They agreed to meet again after sundown. Edric left the chamber with the book wrapped in burlap, stuffed into the bottom of a flour sack. Greta waited outside the chapel archway, nervous, chewing the edge of her apron. "Well?" she asked. "Bad," Edric replied. "Very bad. But there might be a way to stop it." She followed him to the edge of the inner courtyard, where the servant children played, unaware of the storm coiling above their heads. One of them, the butcher's boy, stopped and stared at Edric with an oddly fixed expression. Then he said, voice not quite his own, "The debt remains unpaid," and collapsed. They rushed to him, but his eyes were blank. Another name would need to be added to the ledger, and Edric knew, whatever ancient power lived beneath stone and silence, it was growing restless. Too many secrets had been disturbed, too many whispers heard. The balance had shifted, the castle had tasted resistance, and now it would begin to hunger anew. Chapter 12. Beneath the feast hall, the kitchen roared with life as the feast of lanterns neared, fires blazing, pots clanging, and every servant soaked in sweat from dusk until late afternoon. But Edric felt no joy in the preparations, only the creeping cold beneath his collar that returned each time his hand brushed the flour sack, where the steward's book lay hidden, pulsing like a second heartbeat against his hip, humming faintly when he passed under the old stone archways. The castle had begun to speak in creaks and echoes again. As it did before something vanished, as it did the night Tomas was taken. Greta hadn't slept for 2 days. She spent her free time tracing steps through corridors Edric marked on stolen parchment maps from the steward's walls. They mapped out the original layout of the Casola pattern of concentric chambers, like a coiled serpent, with the feast hall directly above the lowest vault. "The oldest part," she whispered one morning, spreading ink-stained fingers across the drawing, "was built atop something deeper, older than the keep, older than the stones." Edric nodded, his gaze falling to the small rune at the center of the map, the one drawn over with red ink in every version they'd found. It looked like an eye, or a mouth, or both. That night, as the other servants roasted pheasants and carved root vegetables into ornate shapes for the nobles, Edric made his way toward the west wall. There, behind a curtain of moldy tapestries, was a small iron door with a rusted ring and hinges that groaned like the moan of a dying man. The key he took from Eldon's ring fitted perfectly. The tunnel beyond descended in a tight spiral, lit only by a single torch Edric carried, the flame jittering as if the air resisted its warmth. Each step felt steeper than the last. The walls grew damper. The sound of dripping water gave way to something slower, thicker, like sap or blood falling from height. At the bottom, the passage opened into a crypt carved directly into the mountain stone, and the air smelled of copper and ash. Bones lay in neat rows beside unmarked altars, each altar scratched with the same symbol from the map, etched deep into the rock with soot-blackened tools. Edric's torch flickered again. He knelt, brushing away the dust from one altar, and uncovered a carving words in a script he couldn't read, but which his hands strangely recognized. As he touched the letters, something clicked behind him. A hidden seam in the wall split open, grinding outward to reveal a new path, narrow and low, filled with stale air and the distant sound of bells. He ducked and stepped through. This second passage curved downward again, then opened suddenly into a hollow chamber beneath the very center of the feast hall. Above him, muffled voices laughed and music played, the nobles oblivious to the nightmare curled beneath their feet. In this chamber stood a stone pillar, like the one from his earlier descent, but larger, pulsing faintly with heat as if alive. Around it, the floor was carved into a perfect circle, and within it lay symbols, names, dates, this time etched in gold. The room shimmered like it existed slightly outside time. In the center of the circle stood 5 raised stones, like thrones or altars, and on each was a name: Greta, Eldon, the butcher's boy, Lady Isolde, and Edric. His name was newest, carved in still-drying resin. The realization struck him like a blow to the chest. These weren't just names, they were sacrifices. The next offering he turned to flee, but something behind him moved. The pillar cracked open slightly, revealing not light, but darkness that swirled and churned like ink in water. A voice emerged, not a whisper this time, but a chorus, deep and commanding, echoing within the stone and inside Edric's mind. You have come again, not as prey, but as witness. Edric's legs shook. What do you want? The voice replied. What is owed? The balance. The promise sealed in blood, renewed each generation. The feast is not of food alone. I won't let it happen, Edric shouted. Not this time. You already have, the voice answered. Your breath, your step, your name upon the stone. All are consent. All are offering. The darkness surged forward, but as it reached Edric's boots, the dagger at his belt glowed. The same dagger he found near Tomasis's bones. The darkness recoiled. You bear the mark of the unbroken, it hissed. One who escaped. Then Edric knew. Tomas had not died. He had broken the pact and fled, and the blade he left behind was part of that defiance. You can't bind me, Edric said, stepping backward. I choose who I serve. But the voice only laughed a laugh that turned the stone walls wet with condensation and cracked a line across the chamber's ceiling. You serve still, by knowing, by seeing. You carry the burden of truth, and that too is service. Suddenly, the pillar snapped shut. The symbols on the floor faded. Above him, the music of the feast stopped. A scream pierced the air. Another, then silence. Edric ran back through the passage, up the stairwell, and burst through the iron door into the hallway. Servants ran past, screaming, plates shattered, fires flared. He made his way to the feast hall and stopped dead. The nobles were frozen in place. Literally, their skin was gray, eyes wide open. They sat as if held by invisible hands, each face twisted in the final moment of horror. Lady Isolde stood mid-step, her hand reaching toward the main table, her throat slit without a blade in sight. Only the servants remained untouched. The castle had chosen, the debt had been paid, but at what cost? Greta found Edric standing in the hall's center, unable to speak. She touched his hand, and he flinched. They're all dead, she said quietly. No, Edric whispered. They're not dead, they've been claimed. In the echo of the still-burning torches, they heard the faint tolling of a bell. Deep beneath the feast hall, the pillar pulsed once more, and the circle of offerings, incomplete just hours ago, was now whole. Chapter 13. Greta's Oath. Greta sat by the fire, silent, her hands clutching the dagger Edric found in the crypt below, its blade glinting with a strange reflection that didn't match the hearth's flames, as if lit by something deeper, older than fire. Edric sat beside her, bruised and speechless, watching the sparks rise into the chimney like fleeing spirits, desperate to escape the castle's grasp. They hadn't spoken in hours, since the nobles' bodies were discovered, stiff and gray, arranged in silence like mannequins, forgotten by time. The steward had vanished, his chamber empty, his robes left folded on the bed, his ledgers scattered as if torn apart by wind. Outside, the village watched the keep from a distance, torches flickering near the outer gates, whispers of plague, poison, and curses growing louder with every passing hour. "We have to leave," Edric finally said, though his voice sounded far away, like it didn't quite belong to him anymore. Greta didn't answer right away, only stared at the dagger, fingers tightening as she traced the hilt's carved symbols with the edge of her thumbnail. "This isn't just about running," she whispered. "It never was. If we leave, it follows us. Or worse, it spreads." Edric frowned. "It's tied to this place." Greta shook her head. "No, it's tied to names, to knowledge, to memory. And you saw the circle. Your name, my name." The truth clawed at Edric's chest. The curse wasn't confined by stone walls or locked doors. It lived through knowing. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked, voice trembling. "Stay and be part of it. Feed it." Greta looked at him, then truly looked, her eyes burning with something fierce and resolute. "We break it," she said. "Whatever bargain was made, whatever power lives in the dark, it's not a god. It can bleed." Edric's breath caught. "You want to fight it?" Greta stood, wrapping the dagger in linen, slipping it into her belt, then pulled her cloak over her shoulders. "I want to end it," she said, "before the next offering is chosen." She walked to the old steward's chamber, where the symbols covered every inch of the walls. Books bound in skin, charts of eclipses, diagrams of human bodies, overlaid with astrological signs. In the middle of the room sat a basin filled with dried blood and ashes. "This is where the names were chosen," Greta murmured, pouring lamp oil into the basin, "where the circle began." Edric stepped closer. "Then we burn it." Greta nodded and dropped a lit taper into the bowl. Flames erupted, not in gold or red, but blue and violet, reaching toward the ceiling like grasping hands. The symbols on the walls screamed literally, screamed as if 1,000 voices trapped in ink begged for mercy. They burned for hours. And in that time, the castle groaned and cracked, a tremor rippling through the stones, like something deep within had been wounded. By morning, the smoke had cleared, the symbols had vanished, and the books were gone. Only soot and silence remained. But the dagger still pulsed. "We're not finished," Greta said. "This was only the head of the snake. Its body runs deeper." That afternoon, they descended back into the crypts, not as intruders this time, but as challengers. Greta led the way with a lantern in one hand, the dagger in the other, while Edric carried salt, ash, and cold iron rings forged in the blacksmith's fire. They followed the path beneath the feast hall, now cracked and trembling, its stones softening like wax. In the circle chamber, the pillar stood cracked, faint light leaking from its seams like molten silver. The floor still bore their names, though Greta's had begun to fade, smudged, as if uncertain. She stepped into the circle, and the chamber responded. The light from the pillar surged, illuminating the gold lines on the floor, revealing new etchings faces, dozens of them, twisted in agony, whispering through gritted teeth. Greta raised the dagger. "I name you false god, parasite of oaths, feeder of blood, and defiler of free will." The chamber shook violently, the pillar cracking again. Edric scattered the salt in a wide arc. "I break your bond," Greta cried, "in the name of the nameless, in the name of the forgotten." The faces on the floor began to wail. The darkness surged from the pillar's core, reaching for Greta, clawing with smoky tendrils, whispering her name with every breath. She plunged the dagger into the center rune. A scream unlike any human sound erupted, and the entire castle groaned, as if exhaling for the first time in centuries. The light turned red, the ground split beneath the pillar, swallowing it in one gulp, and then silence. Not a peaceful silence, but a hollow one, like the pause after a funeral bell. The chamber dimmed, the lines vanished, and the dagger, now dull and cracked, crumbled in Greta's hand like ash. They stood in the dark, breathless, the air finally still. Edric spoke softly. "Is it over?" Greta looked up. "No, but it's wounded, and we're no longer its servants." They climbed the stairs slowly, emerging into a castle that no longer watched them. The shadows had retreated. The whispers had ceased. In the courtyard, the sun rose for the first time in days, painting the stones in gold instead of gray. Villagers approached the gates, cautious but curious, sensing the shift. And in the fields beyond, crows flew away from the keep instead of toward it. Greta turned to Edric. "We're not just servants anymore." He nodded. "We're witnesses." "No," she said. "We're keepers now." And with that, the two walked down from the castle into a world unaware of how close it had come to forgetting its own name. Chapter 14. The Book of Dust. The air was different that morning, dry and laced with a smell of scorched stone, as if the castle had exhaled centuries of rot and memory into the open fields around it. Greta and Edric walked with purpose, but their steps were slower, heavier, the weight of silence now carried on their backs. Villagers greeted them with wary eyes, offering bread and questions in equal measure, unsure whether to kneel or run. Rumors had already started. Some called them chosen, others whispered curse-breakers or servants of the bone god. But Greta only nodded and moved forward, eyes fixed on the small chapel at the edge of the valley woods. It was older than the castle, older than any villager could remember. Its roof half collapsed, vines strangling its bell tower. Inside, it was colder than the wind outside, the air still and heavy like forgotten water at the bottom of a well. Edric struck flint to torch, revealing crumbling murals painted with ash and blood, saints with missing eyes and halos shaped like chains. Beneath the altar lay a sealed box of dark oak, bound with 7 iron latches, each carved with the mark of the old steward. Greta's hands hovered over it, feeling the vibration in the wood like a heartbeat, slow but steady, as though it waited for her alone. She unlatched the first clasp with a whispered oath. The iron hissed as if offended, but it yielded. One by one, the locks opened, reluctant guardians giving way to something deeper than mere parchment or prayer. Inside was a single book, wrapped in gray velvet stitched with bone thread, its cover cracked like dry skin beneath a frost. The title was scrawled in a forgotten script neither of them could read, but they both understood what it meant. This was the ledger of the debt, the true source of the curse, the book in which names became fuel. Edric reached out, but Greta stopped him. "Not yet. It sees us. We mustn't show fear." She opened the cover slowly. Dust spilled out, thick and choking. But it wasn't just dust. Names written in black ink shimmered and shifted as if alive, reorganizing themselves to show their last breath, last thought, last scream. The first name was a child, age 7, chosen during a lunar eclipse 400 years ago. The second was a midwife, accused of letting twins survive, marked as a debt to balance the unnatural birth. And then, halfway through the book, Greta saw her own name. Edric's followed, inked just below in the same shaky script. They stared at the words, horrified, their fate etched centuries before their birth, their lives already spent before they began. "How is this possible?" Edric whispered. "We were born into a lie." Greta touched her name and felt warmth, as though her soul had been threaded through the parchment. "We were born to break it," she said, "or die continuing it." Below their names was an entry not yet completed, a space reserved, its edges pulsing softly like skin over a vein. A final sacrifice, one that hadn't been fulfilled. "I think the circle expected us to fail," Greta said, tracing the empty space. "This page is waiting." Edric looked at her. "So if we refuse to die, the book stays incomplete." Greta shook her head. "No, something else takes our place, something worse. We have to close the book." "But how?" Edric asked. "We don't even understand the rules. This ledger isn't just Inkit's magic fed by memory." Greta turned the final page and found a map sketched in dried blood, leading back to the castle, not the visible keep, but deep below. "There's another chamber," she murmured. "A place beyond the crypt, beneath the foundations, the original altar." They left the chapel without speaking further, walking under clouds that swirled but never broke. The land knew, the sky watched, and the wind carried no bird song, only the rustling of secrets. Back at the castle, they moved through empty halls, dust motes floating like ghosts, unbothered by breath or life. The kitchen was still, the scullery unchanged, but in the cellar, behind a wall of rotten wine barrels, Greta found the passage. She pressed her palm against the stones, whispering the name of the child from the book's first page. The wall groaned and slid inward, revealing stairs that descended deeper than light could follow. They lit torches and stepped into the dark, each stair older than language, each step a memory someone had tried to forget. The passage ended at a door of petrified bone, carved with the same symbols from the steward's room. Greta placed the book on the door. It opened without a sound. Inside was a room of impossible size, a dome stretching wider than the castle's foundation, lit by torches that never burned out. At the center was a pedestal. Upon it, a mirror shaped like a closed eye, framed in rusted gold. And floating above it was a key, spinning slowly in air, humming a tune they didn't recognize but felt in their ribs. Greta approached. The key lowered as she neared, the mirror flickering open like a lid peeled back from a blind eye. Inside, they saw themselves not as they were, but as they had been in 1,000 lifetimes before. Always servants, always chosen, always dying. Greta reached for the key. The mirror whispered, "Break the name, become the dust." She gripped the key and turned it in the air. The mirror shattered, but not with sound, with silence so loud it deafened them. The pedestal split, the room groaned, and the ledger in Edric's arms caught flame. Not a fire of heat, but of unmaking letters, unthreading paper, crumbling into sparks of forgotten memories. When it ended, the mirror was gone. The key was gone, and the book no longer existed. They climbed the stairs again, every step lighter, every breath easier. And when they emerged, the sky was blue for the first time in memory. The villagers smiled without suspicion. The castle stood, but it no longer watched. Greta looked at her hands. No mark, no pull, no echo of fate. Edric whispered, "It's done." Greta smiled. "Now we choose who we are." And for the first time in centuries, the land forgot their names, sand that was a blessing. Chapter 15. The Thorn Feast. The sun rose unevenly, its light bleeding across the hills like a spilled goblet of golden wine. And for the first time in weeks, Greta did not wake to screaming geese or ash on the wind. The castle's air had changed, no longer haunted, but not quite healed either, like a wound stitched too quickly. Edric was already awake, grinding herbs in a mortar, the rhythmic crunch steadying his mind more than any prayer ever had. The village bell tolled 6 times for mourning, twice for labor, twice for remembrance, and this time it echoed clean. There was talk now of a feast, one to mark the end of fear and the return of will. The steward's old hall, empty since the circle collapsed, would host the first celebration in over a generation. Greta and Edric had been asked to attend not as servants, but as honored guests. And yet, even in joy, unease lingered like an invisible frost behind the smile of every invitation. They dressed plainly, refusing the embroidered cloaks offered by the bailiff, choosing instead linen and wool they'd washed themselves. On the walk to the hall, villagers bowed their heads slightly, still unsure if they were bowing to survivors or something more. Inside the hall, tapestries had been washed, floors scrubbed, and a long wooden table now glistened with fat roasted birds and spiced root vegetables. Children played near the hearth, their laughter unfamiliar, like music from a forgotten time. But Greta could feel it beneath the meat, the music, the mead. Something else watched. Edric sat beside her at the head of the table, uncomfortable in the carved chair once reserved for the Lord's ghost. A woman stood at the center. Maret, the new matron of Graneshee, raised her cup and declared the feast begun. Dancers spun in tight circles, flower dust swirling from their skirts like pale smoke in candlelight. Greta tried to enjoy the bread, still warm, crusted with salt and rosemary, but her hands trembled on the knife. She leaned toward Edric and whispered, "Something's wrong. The book is gone, but the memory isn't." He nodded. "I feel it too, like something hollow that refuses to stay empty." As the feast progressed, the fire burned lower, but no one added wood. Yet it didn't go out. The stew stayed warm despite no heat, the mead sweetened with no bees to account for it. A child walked up to Greta with a crown of woven thorns and asked if she would wear it. She smiled and declined, but when she looked back, the child had vanished without taking another step. Edric whispered, "Did you see?" "Yes," Greta said. "He wasn't breathing." Across the table, an old man recited a riddle none had heard before, his voice layered like echoes in a cistern. 1 for the name, 2 for the flame, 3 for the silence that ends the game. Laughter followed, but Greta noticed the stew around him curdled, a pale film spreading over it like decay. She stood quickly, knocking her cup. "This feast is not for us." The hall quieted. Edric rose beside her. "Who lit the fire?" No one answered. "Who cooked the birds?" Greta asked. Still silence. And then Maret spoke, but it was not her voice. "You broke the book, but not the debt. You ended the curse, but not the hunger." Her eyes rolled back, white as boiled eggs, and the walls began to breathe. Yes, breathy, expanding and contracting like lungs behind stone. Edric pulled Greta backward as the long table split down the center, blood seeping from its grain like sap from wounded bark. Guests froze, some mid-bite, meat half swallowed, others crying silently without tears. At the center of the room, rising from the cracked tiles, came roots black, gnarled, dripping with sap the color of oil. Greta whispered, "It's the Thorn Feast, the old celebration." Not a meal, but a binding, the castle had remembered. Even without the book, the tradition was written into its bones. Edric unsheathed the old iron key he'd kept, its metal warped, but still humming faintly. He plunged it into the floor, and the roots hissed, retreating slightly like snakes from flame. Greta stepped forward. "This ends now. We are not your servants." The walls moaned, and Mirette levitated, vines sprouting from her mouth, eyes, and hands. The villagers screamed, but their feet stuck to the stone, vines snaring ankles like chains. Greta pulled the thorn crown from the ground and placed it on her head. Blood ran down her forehead immediately, but she didn't flinch. "This crown belongs to me," she said, "and I wear it freely, not to serve, but to command." The roots halted, the vines slackened, Mirette collapsed, and from deep below, the castle groaned one last time, then fell silent. The fire died, the food rotted instantly. The guests awoke, dazed, some crying, others vomiting, no memory of the last hour. Greta removed the crown. The blood stopped. Edric looked at her, shaken. "You took its symbol." "I did," she replied. "Now it answers to me, and I say the feast is over." They walked out together. Behind them, the hall began to crumble, not with destruction, but with relief. No more cursed banquets, no more false celebrations. Greta glanced back once more. "The castle will forget now," Edric nodded, "and the village will remember who made that possible." Greta smiled. Let them remember. But never again should they invite something older than time to dinner. As they reached the edge of the village, dawn bloomed again, this time with warmth instead of warning, and in the fields the wheat grew tall, clean, and without the faint taste of blood. Chapter 16. Ashes in the bell tower. By the third morning after the feast, the sky turned colorless, not gray, not white, just blank, as if the heavens themselves had been scraped clean by something trying to forget what it witnessed. Greta and Edric awoke in silence, the birds absent, the wind still, even the river outside their window unnaturally quiet. The new steward sent word that the village bell had stopped ringing, though no one had dared climb to inspect it. Superstition held that the bell tower, built 3 generations ago, was sacred ground, only touched by time, not by hand. But now, villagers whispered of black dust spilling from its windows, of ghostly clanging at night, with no wind to stir it. Greta knew they would come to her again, as they always did when things bent toward the strange. She dressed plainly, binding her hair beneath her wool cap, and strapped a belt knife across her waist. Edric followed without needing to ask. His silence had become the strongest answer over the last few days. The bell tower loomed above the town square, its shadow cutting across the baker's shingles like a sword through dough. Children stared from windows as they passed, and an old woman clutched a cross to her lips, eyes wide with quiet dread. At the base of the tower, soot pooled like snow, swirling when they stepped through it, leaving prints too large for human feet. Edric knelt and touched the ash. It clung to his skin, refusing to fall away even when he wiped it twice. Greta looked up. "If it's what I think it is, we won't hear just a bell." The stairs inside creaked, warped from moisture and time, groaning under each step as if resisting their climb. They rose slowly, passing old carvings of saints and forgotten rulers, their eyes scratched out centuries ago. Halfway up, the air turned warm, not from fire, but from something deeper, like breath, trapped in stone for too long. At the top, The bell hung still, wrapped in thick ropes of ivy that hadn't been there the day before. Greta stepped forward, hand outstretched, when a sound echoed, not a ring, but a whisper stretched across metal. She froze. "Did you hear that?" Edric nodded, pale. "It said my name 3 times. The air shimmered above the bell like heat on stone. And then something dropped from the rafters, a feather, blackened and wet. More followed, each one falling without a bird to birth it, until the floor around them was covered in oily plumage. The ivy twitched, the bell began to bleed. Thick rivulets of black ichor leaked down its sides, hissing where it touched the metal, releasing smoke that smelled like burnt parchment and tears. Greta drew her blade. "We're not alone." From the shadows behind the bell, a shape moved tall, robed in scraps of spiderweb and charcoal, its eyes to open pits. It spoke, but not with words. Its voice was the sound of nails on wood, of rope tightening, of bells falling. Greta resisted the urge to run. "You are not part of this village." The thing tilted its head. "I was, long ago. Before you replaced prayer with salt. Before you silenced the old tongues." Edric stepped forward. "What do you want?" "To ring," it replied. "Once more. So the dead may find their names again." Greta shook her head. "No, the dead were at peace. You want them restless." The figure reached out, a single bony hand pressing to the bell's side. It rang, but not with sound, with memory. Each toll was a life unfinished, a soul unspoken. Edric fell to his knees, bleeding from the nose, whispering his brother's name, a brother who had died, stillborn. Greta stabbed the ground with her blade, anchoring herself to the present. "You cannot toll again," she said. "Your time is ash. Your purpose is finished. If I stop," it whispered, "they forget." "Then let them forget," Greta said. "There is mercy in forgetting." The tower shuddered, bricks cracked. The bell swung, once, twice, but no sound came. Greta rushed forward and placed her hand on the bell, heat searing her skin. "I forgive you," she whispered. The bell cracked. The ash swirled upward, lifting in a silent cyclone, and the shadow vanished into the sky like smoke from a snuffed candle. Edric gasped, clutching Greta's arm. "Is it over?" She looked at the bell. The crack had split it down the center. "It can't ring again," she said. "Not ever." They climbed down, slower than before, ash falling behind them like rain. Outside, villagers stood with candles, unsure if they'd heard anything, or merely dreamed the silence breaking. Greta turned to them. "The tower is clean. The past is sealed." No one cheered, but they nodded, and that was enough. Later that evening, Greta wrapped her burned hand in wool and sat by the fire with Edric beside her. He stirred the pot gently. "It said forgetting was cruelty. And I said, forgetting can be mercy," she replied. "That's a debate older than this land." He looked at her. "Would you forget if you could?" She shook her head. "Not after what we survived. Some stories deserve to be remembered, even if they hurt." The bell never rang again. But in the wind that night, one might have heard a whisper, not a warning, not a cry, just a name spoken, one last time. Chapter 17. The quiet beneath the orchard. By the time morning broke, mist covered the village fields like a blanket soaked in silver, and Greta awoke with the lingering scent of burnt ivy still clinging to her skin like a memory. Edric had already left the cottage, drawn by rumors of something stirring beyond the orchard, where trees bent unnaturally eastward and crows refused to land, circling like wardens of a forgotten place. The orchard had once belonged to the Lord's grandfather, a peaceful grove of apples, pears, and apricots grown in rigid, symmetrical rows. But for weeks now, the trees near the edge had begun twisting toward something unseen, forming a curve where straight lines once ruled. Greta tied her cloak tighter around her chest and headed toward the orchard, every step thick with the weight of expectation and unease. The villagers gave her space as she passed, not out of fear, but out of the reverence reserved for someone who faced darkness and walked away unchanged. She met Edric at the tree line, where dirt turned darker, almost black, and the grass grew in strange loops instead of blades. He pointed to the farthest tree. "Something's under there," I heard breathing from beneath the roots. Greta raised an eyebrow. "From the earth itself," he nodded, "like a sleeper trapped below." They stepped through the twisted branches, brushing away bark that flaked off like old paint, revealing pulsing veins beneath the surface. Each step they took was muffled, not by soil, but by something deeper, unnatural silence that soaked into their ears like thick smoke. Birdsong faded. The world shrank to the sound of breath, heartbeat, and rustling bark, whispering secrets neither could understand. At the center of the orchard stood a tree, unlike the rest, blackened, hunched, its branches wrapped tightly like arms around something it didn't want to release. Beneath its roots, the earth had split open just enough to see the outline of a swan skeletal and half buried in moss. Edric leaned down and brushed aside the leaves, revealing a skull, not of man or animal, but something in between. With 6 eye sockets and a jaw fused shut by what looked like melted stone. The roots writhed gently when touched, retreating as if sensing they'd been discovered. Greta knelt, eyes locked on the thing beneath. "It's not a grave, it's a prison," Edric paled. "Do we dig it up?" She shook her head. "We need to understand why it was buried." She reached into her satchel and drew out a small copper amulet, one given to her by the mute boy in the square, who hadn't spoken in years. It vibrated in her hand now, slowly spinning on its cord before pointing toward the skull. Greta stepped closer, and the ground responded, shivering like skin under cold water. A voice rose not from the tree, not from the earth, but from inside their heads. "You seek what should remain unnamed." Edric stumbled back, clutching his ears. "It's in me," Greta steadied him. "It's not in you, it's through you, like a gate." The skull pulsed once, glowing faintly, and then images burst across Greta's vision fields of burning orchards, chains forged from moonlight, and a voice screaming without breath. The orchard wasn't just a place of harvest. It had once been a barrier, a soft prison, built around something that could not die but must not live. "Someone bound this thing," Greta whispered, "a long time ago, using the trees, the fruit, the roots. It was sealed with cycles. The seasons had weakened. The fruit no longer ripened. The soil soured. The seal was breaking." Greta turned to Edric. "We need someone who knows the old ways. Before the chapel, before the scripts." He hesitated. "The crone in the western hills," Greta nodded. "She's not feared because she's evil. She's feared because she remembers." They covered the skull in layers of ash and salt, and left a ring of iron nails around the tree before returning to the village. By dusk, Greta rode out, leaving Edric behind with strict orders. "Do not let anyone touch that soil, even if they cry for it." The western hills stretched far and bleak, dusted with wildflowers that didn't bloom but stared upward like unblinking eyes. The crone's hut was more burrow than housepart wood, part root, part something older than either. Greta knocked only once before the door swung open on its own. Inside, the air smelled of mushrooms and memory, and a voice crackled from the shadows. "You opened the orchard," the crone said, not asking. Greta nodded. "It's waking." The crone emerged slowly, hair trailing behind her like spider silk, hands marked by rings of rust and bark. "You have 7 days, no more. If it breaks fully free, it won't rise a tall root." Greta frowned. "What does that mean?" "It will not walk the world. It will become the world. And we will all grow inside it." The crone handed her a bundle wrapped in reeds inside, seeds blacker than night and cold to the touch. "Plant these in its mouth. They will seal it, but only if you remember its name." Greta asked. "What is its name?" The crone's eyes clouded. "That is your price to pay." Greta left before nightfall, the wind following her home, whispering words she didn't yet recognize, but would soon come to understand. Back in the orchard, Edric waited, sword in hand, watching as the ground cracked further and roots twisted like fingers, reaching upward from a sleeping giant. He had heard the voice again. It had learned his name, and now it was asking for Greta. Chapter 18. Salt beneath the floorboards. By the time Greta returned from the Crone's Hills, the sky had grown swollen with clouds, gray and heavy, like a warning from the heavens draped across the village roofs in silence. The orchard behind her hummed with a presence that never slept, and now even the soil underfoot pulsed faintly with breath. She clutched the bundle of black seeds tightly, their chill soaking through the fabric and into her fingertips like frozen whispers. Each step toward the village felt heavier than the last, as if gravity thickened the closer she got to the chapel walls. Children stood at doorways, staring at nothing, while chickens refused to cross the thresholds of barns, as if sensing something buried beneath. The cobbler's dog lay motionless in the dirt, eyes wide open and tongue blackened, though no wounds marked his fur. At Greta's cottage, Edric waited with a torch in hand and terror in his eyes, pacing a groove into the mud outside the door. "They came last night," he muttered. "Villagers. They don't remember it, but I do. They tried to dig." Greta stepped inside and bolted the door behind them, drawing the shutters closed with trembling fingers as shadows danced like insects on the walls. She poured a circle of salt around the floorboards where the wood had warped, flexed upward like something underneath had pushed against it. The chapel bells had rung at midnight, though no one had pulled the rope hand. Now the sound echoed every hour on its own. "We're out of time," Greta said, removing the black seeds from the bundle and pressing them into a small bowl of milk and blood. Edric asked, "Where do we plant them?" She looked down at the boards. "Here." Edric's face paled. "In your house," Greta nodded. "The orchard is no longer the prison. The roots followed me. It's here now." She pried the boards loose with the rusted end of a pitchfork, revealing a crawl space beneath dry at first glance, but glistening beneath the surface. Black mold slithered along the beams like veins, and in the center, embedded in the dirt, was a second skull identical to the one in the orchard. It grinned up at them with fused teeth, and around its base lay a ring of finger bones, all pointing inward like tiny arrows. Greta placed one seed into each eye socket and whispered the words the crone had etched into her memory with fire and ash. The room darkened, not from nightfall, but from something internal, as if the house had blinked and forgotten how to open its eyes. The floorboards groaned and shifted, then settled into stillness, and for a moment all seemed quiet, until they heard it a knock from under the house. Not the desperate hammering of something trapped, but a polite, measured rapping, as if whatever lay below was asking for permission. Greta stepped back, heart pounding. We didn't seal it, we woke it. Edric dropped the torch. You said the seeds would bind it. They will, she said, but only if it accepts the offering. And it hasn't. The knocking continued. Greta ran to her cupboard and retrieved a small jar of soot and a sharpened nail, drawing sigils across the doorways, windows, and floor. She pressed her hand to the beam above the hearth and began chanting, low guttural, words not meant for tongues but for roots. The wind outside rose like a tide, slamming against the walls and shaking loose dried herbs from the ceiling. The skull in the floor turned slowly to face her, its sockets now lit from within by a faint yellow flame. I know your name, she whispered, trembling. I will not say it, but I will not forget. The flames vanished. The skull split in two. From within emerged a single, golden coin ancient, etched with a face whose eyes had been scratched out violently by some previous hand. Greta picked it up. This is the tithe. Edric blinked. The what? To buy silence, she said. For one night only. She placed the coin beneath her tongue and waited, heart racing. The knocking stopped. The roots beneath the house withdrew. Outside, the air stilled. For the first time in weeks, no voices whispered, no bells rang, no birds watched. Edric collapsed into the chair by the fire. What now? Greta spit the coin into a jar of salt and corked it shut. We have until sundown tomorrow. What happens then? She looked him in the eyes. It will ask again, louder. That night, they did not sleep. They sat with candles burning low, ears trained to every creak of the beams, every flutter outside the shuttered windows. Greta reread the crone's markings, trying to decipher the name buried between symbols, an ancient moniker older than the dirt itself, but the ink blurred when looked at directly. It was as if the name did not want to be seen, only remembered in the marrow of bones. Just before dawn, the jar holding the coin cracked with a sharp hiss, and a black mist escaped, trailing across the ceiling like a snake. It curled toward Greta, hovering above her, then darted down into her mouth before she could scream. Her eyes rolled back, her hands clawed at the floor. Edric leaped to her side, but before he could touch her, her body went still, breath gone. Then she spoke, not in her own voice, but in one layered with hundreds young, old beast and shadow. I remember, she said. Then she gasped and coughed, collapsing into his arms. When she awoke, her eyes were different, darker, as if something else had climbed inside and stayed. She whispered, I know its name now. And as the sun cracked the edge of the horizon, a new sound rose from the village, one no one had heard in generations. The floorboards beneath them shifted again. Only this time they breathed. Chapter 19. The Tongue in the Well by Morning. The village no longer smelled of smoke or bread, but of old copper and damp stone, as though the very earth had split open and let something old seep upward through the cracks. Greta stood at the well, hands trembling, breath visible though it was midsummer, staring down into the abyss beneath the village. No water rippled below, only blackness, too deep to measure, too quiet to trust, as if the well had swallowed the sky itself. Edric held the rope that once drew buckets, now coiled like a serpent beside his foot, unused since the bells began tolling on their own. We heard it speak last night, he whispered, in your voice, but not yours. What did it say? Greta didn't turn to face him. It gave me a task and a name. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the salt jar containing the fractured coin, now split into 1,000 pieces like shattered bone. "The tithe is broken," she said. "It bought one night. Now it wants permanence. It wants its voice returned." Edric frowned. Voice. Greta dropped a pebble into the well. No sound came back. "It speaks through places it's buried in, but not clearly, not fully, because it lacks its tongue." "And where's that?" Edric asked, already fearing the answer. Greta looked up at him, face pale, eyes hollow. "In the chapel." The silence that followed wrapped the whole square in stillness. The wind refusing to blow, the birds refusing to sing, the insects retreating underground. They walked side by side, past shuttered windows and open doors, past candles burned to stubs and tables left mid-meal, as if the villagers had paused life. The chapel's great wooden doors stood slightly ajar, one hinge creaking with every breath of movement, though no one else was there to touch them. Inside, the pews had collapsed under their own weight, dust thick as fog, crucifixes missing from the walls, replaced by runes carved in nail and tooth. The altar had cracked down the center, revealing a cavity lined with soot, inside which lay a single human tongue, leathery, gray, and wrapped in twine. Greta moved forward, each step guided not by courage but inevitability, as if her fate had been carved long before her birth. She knelt and unwrapped the tongue, and the room groaned in response, a deep vibration rising from beneath the stone floor. "It was taken from it," she whispered, "by monks, buried here, hidden to weaken its reach." Edric watched from the doorway. "And now we're giving it back." Greta nodded. "So it can speak clearly and stop twisting the minds of everyone around." "But what if it doesn't stop?" he asked. "What if that's a lie?" She didn't answer. She just walked to the altar, tongue in hand, and looked toward the pulpit where the hymn books once stood. There, in place of scripture, lay a book bound in blackened skin, pages inked in marrow. She opened it to the marked page. There, in jagged script, was the ritual, the reinsertion of the voice. It required the tongue to be submerged in well water infused with the breath of the living and sealed with a name. She closed the book and looked to Edric. "You must blow into the water after I lower it." His hands shook. "And what name do we seal it with?" She placed the tongue into a velvet pouch and began walking back toward the well. "Mine." They stood at the well again, the village behind them still silent, the sky an unnatural white, drained of all warmth. Greta tied the pouch to the bucket rope and lowered it, watching as it vanished into the dark, swallowed like a promise. "Now," she said, "your breath." Edric knelt, took a deep breath, and exhaled into the open shaft. The sound swallowed too quickly, unnaturally, like the wind feared being heard. The rope jerked violently once, twice, then stilled. From deep within, the voice returned, not Greta's, not a man's, but something layered and ancient, like a cathedral full of dying choirs. It spoke a word no human mouth could shape, and yet Edric understood it. "Remember." The ground quaked softly. The village roofs shifted. From beneath the well, water began to rise, not fast, but steadily, black and shining, carrying the pouch upward like a newborn, swaddled in night. Greta retrieved it and opened the pouch. The tongue was gone. In its place, a seed, ivory white, warm to the touch. "What is it?" Edric asked, still kneeling, unable to stand. Greta answered, without looking at him, its voice reborn. She turned and began walking toward the orchard, where the soil cracked and the roots pulsed like veins under skin. Behind her, The chapel bells rang once deep and final. Then silence fell again. But this time it felt different. Not empty, expectant. Chapter 20. When night finally came by dusk, the wind carried voices that did not echo, whispers that clung to rooftops and eaves, curling like smoke from unseen fires. The villagers did not speak. They only listened, ears tilted toward the orchard where Greta now stood barefoot in the furrowed soil. She held the seed cupped in both hands, its surface pulsing faintly, as if alive, as if breathing the same stale air as them all. It had grown heavier since morning, feeding off the whispers, swelling with words unspoken and secrets buried beneath centuries of denial. Edric stood beside the blacksmith's anvil, watching from afar, his chest tight with a pressure he couldn't name, neither fear nor grief, but something older. The well had overflowed at dawn, spilling ink-colored water across the cobbled square, soaking earth that had never tasted rain in months. Where the water touched, the moss turned red, and the wood beneath the doors warped, as if rejecting the liquid entirely. They understood now the village was never meant to last, not like this. It was a holding place, a chamber sealed from the rest of the world, meant to contain something, not nurture anyone. Greta stepped deeper into the orchard, where the roots cracked like brittle bones beneath her weight, each step releasing a sour-sweet scent of rot and milk. She stopped where the ground gave slightly softer than elsewhere, as if something had been buried beneath centuries ago, never disturbed. "This is where the first one fell," she said aloud, though no one was near enough to hear her words. "The first to strike the deal, the first to bury the debt." Greta knelt and began digging with her bare hands, the soil giving way too easily, as if eager to be turned, as if waiting. Within moments, she unearthed a small box, wrapped in brittle hide, sealed with a symbol burned into its lida tongue with no mouth. She opened it. Inside was a second seed, cracked and dead. Its voice had never sprouted. It had been denied breath. She placed the living seed beside the husk, the contrast stark vibrant life next to powdery decay, like soul beside a memory. The village behind her stirred. Windows shuttered, candles flickered out without wind. One by one, the townsfolk emerged from their homes, not by choice but compulsion. Drawn by some frequency their bones could no longer resist. They gathered at the edge of the orchard, barefoot and silent, eyes wide with sleep they could not wake from. Greta stood, holding both seeds. "This place was never ours," she said, loud enough for them all to hear. "We were its dream, its delay, its punishment." No one wept, no one fled, they only listened. The wind shifted again. The trees bent forward, creaking, not with weather, but with acknowledgement, like elders bowing in shame. She placed the living seed into the hole, beside its failed sibling. From her satchel, she pulled the last vial of salt and poured it over them both. Then, with her own blood drawn from a bite to her thumb, she traced the rune of forgiveness over the soil. The sky turned violet, not the gentle violet of dusk, but the bruised hue of deep injury, the world itself blackening at the edges. The bell in the chapel did not toll but cracked, its top split clean off, falling into the nave with the sound of splintering judgment. Greta whispered the word she had heard in the well, "Remember," and the orchard groaned. Not a quake, not a storm, but a slow inhalation as if the entire land had been waiting for permission to wake. The villagers fell to their knees, not in worship, in surrender. The trees shed their bark like skin, revealing sinew beneath red and gold. veined and warmened from their branches. Fruit grew, not apples, not pears, but eyes, open and watching, irises of every shade, blinking slowly. The seedling broke the soil. It rose, not like a sapling, but like a spine vertebrae after vertebrae, wrapped in bark and pulsing with light. It had no leaves, only fingers, reaching. The villagers wept now, not from fear, but recognition. They had returned, not to peace, but to the truth they had buried. Greta turned to Edric, who stood frozen, mouth agape, eyes hollow. It asked to speak, she said, her voice steady. Now it has. What? What will it say? He stammered. Greta looked skyward, where the stars now blinked in unnatural patterns, forming shapes that resembled no constellations they'd ever known. It will name us, she said, and after. She walked back toward the well, not answering, her feet dragging as if her body resisted what her soul had already accepted. The water in the well no longer reflected the sky. It reflected the orchard. It reflected them all. And beneath that reflection something else, waiting. Greta knelt and leaned close, her breath fogging the surface. Speak, she whispered. The water rippled, the trees rustled, and every villager opened their mouth at once. From every throat one voice spoke, not theirs, not hers, but the one they had buried. I remember. The night fell like a curtain drawn too quickly, and for the first time in generations, true darkness arrived, not empty, not silent, but whole. The village slept, not to forget, but to begin again. Chapter 21. The mop that never dried the mop was older than Greta herself, made of twisted flax and bound with a handle carved from ashwood, worn smooth by decades of tired hands. It leaned like an old man in the corner of the kitchen storeroom, beside the broken broom and the dented copper bucket with one ear missing. Every morning at sunrise, Greta fetched the mop and whispered a small apology to it before dragging it toward the hallway. She never knew why she apologized, perhaps because the mop never seemed to dry, no matter how long she left it in the sun. It smelled of old meat, of mildew, of spilled ale and tears, of every secret the castle spilled upon its stones and rugs. The hallway she cleaned first was the eastern gallery, where portraits of long-dead barons watched her in silence with eyes that seemed too new. Their faces never faded, even though the walls cracked and the floorboards buckled with time. Some said the painter had used bone in his paints. As Greta worked, the mop left a faint trail of gray water, which shimmered strangely even in shadow, refusing to absorb into the wood. She never looked too closely at the shimmer. Once she had, and seen her reflection in it blink without her. The mop dragged slowly across a stain near the window, one that always returned by morning, even when she scrubbed with lye and salt. Some claimed the stain was the blood of the steward, who died there 50 years ago after drinking poisoned wine meant for the baron. Others said it was ink from a cursed ledger, a book that could summon storms if read aloud beneath a full moon. Greta didn't care what it was, she only wanted it gone. But every day it reappeared, sometimes larger, sometimes darker. She scrubbed harder, her arms aching, her palms blistered from the coarse wood of the mop handle, worn down to splinters. The window beside her rattled in its frame, though no wind passed through. Outside, the courtyard was still, save for the black goat watching her through the glass. It had one eye, and that eye never blinked. It simply stared as she pushed water around the same stones she cleaned the day before and the day before that. The goat belonged to the cook, or so she claimed, but Greta had never seen it eat, drink, or sleep. It appeared only when she mopped. The hallway floor seemed endless, though it measured no more than 20 strides from end to end. Time slipped while she worked. One morning, she started at dawn, and when she looked out again, the sun had already begun to set. She checked the clock in the parlor. It had stopped. Every clock in the castle had passed, and the bucket was full again, though she had just emptied it moments ago. The water in the bucket rippled, not from movement, but from something inside. She didn't look, not this time. Instead, she whispered another apology to the mop and continued. Sometimes, when she paused to rest, she could hear footsteps following hers, mimicking her path down the hallway with a second delay, but no one else was there. Only the portraits, only the goat, only the ever-wet floor that never dried, even when the fire blazed hot. She began talking to the mop in full sentences, telling it about her dreams, her regrets, her fear that she would one day vanish into the floor and no one would notice. The mop never answered, but the water sometimes bubbled in the bucket when she spoke of home. She had unseen her parents since she was sold to the castle for 10 silver pieces and a jar of pickled eggs. She was 8. Now she was 17, and her fingers had grown calluses the size of coins. The handle of the mop fit her hands perfectly now, almost too perfectly. She wondered if her hands were reshaped for the tool or the other way around. That night, she stayed late to finish. The mop was heavier than usual, and the water turned black. She leaned it against the wall, took one step back, and the hallway behind her was clean. She hadn't reached it yet. The floor was dry, shining, as if polished by a team of servants, not just her. She turned back. The mop was gone. The portraits were smiling, not subtly, not kindly, but with all their teeth, all of them, even the ones who hadn't been smiling before. Greta stumbled backward into the parlor, heart racing, palms wet, though she'd dropped the mop minutes ago. The clocks were ticking again, but backward. A voice behind her said, "You missed a spot." She turned. Only the mop was there, standing upright on its own, dripping, but smiling now, because somehow the grains in its ashwood handle had formed a face, and that face was hers.